Dad said, "You were never worth the trouble." He said it at 8:11 that morning, while I was standing in the church kitchen with a paper cup in one hand and Ben's funeral invoice in the other. By midnight, I had lost the $4,200 my father had promised for the burial, the flower order my mother had chosen herself, and the last reason I still had for defending my parents to other people. Nobody said a word for me. Not my mother, not my sister, not one relative in that empty second pew they were supposed to fill. What they did not know was that Ben had left me a sealed blue envelope 6 days before he died and told me not to open it unless my parents started being practical. 7 weeks later, I put that envelope on a conference table in front of 11 people, and the plan they made with a psychiatrist stopped being private. Have you ever learned your place in your family from one sentence? The fellowship hall smelled like coffee, lemon cleaner, and baked ham from the church ladies already setting out trays for the luncheon. I remember the silverware noise. I remember the folded bulletins stacked by the door. I remember how normal it all looked. That was part of what made it ugly. Ben had died on a Tuesday. The funeral was Saturday. My parents had told me they would sit in the second pew on the left, just behind Naomi and the boys from Ben's fishing club. My mother said she did not want to be too close to the casket because she didn't do well with displays. That was how she spoke when she wanted to make something painful sound tasteful. At 8:11, my phone lit up. Dad. I answered because I still thought grief might make people better for one day. It didn't. "We're not coming," he said. I thought I had heard him wrong. "What do you mean?" "Beth needs us." My sister Beth was 56 years old and had been treated like a weather emergency since she was 14. If Beth needed gas money, my father drove across town. If Beth cried, my mother stopped sleeping. If I needed anything, it was discussed in terms of timing and practicality. "It's Ben's funeral," I said. Dad let out a breath like I was delaying him. "We've done more than enough." Then he said the line. After that, I could hear the refrigerator hum in the church kitchen and somebody dragging folding chairs in the hall. My mother was in the background. I heard her once. Daniel. Just his name, not a defense, not a correction, just a small warning to lower his voice, not change his mind. When the call ended, I stood there with the paper cup going soft in my hand. Naomi found me first. Ben's sister had been carrying a casserole dish in both hands. She stopped, set it down on the counter, and shut the kitchen door with her hip. She had heard enough through the speaker. That was the first witness. I did the service anyway. There is no noble way to say that. I walked down the aisle. I sat through the music Ben had chosen months before, back when we still used the word months like it belonged to us. I held the church bulletin so tightly the paper creased under my thumb. My son sat on one side of me. Naomi sat on the other. The second pew on the left stayed empty all morning. An empty seat can humiliate you more quietly than a slap. People noticed. Aunt Sandra noticed. My cousin Denise noticed. The pastor noticed. Nobody said anything because everybody in my family had been trained the same way. If the surface still looked intact, you protected it. At the graveside, Beth arrived alone in dark sunglasses and a coat with the store tag still half tucked into one sleeve. She touched my elbow and said, "Mom and Dad are trying to keep things from getting worse." I looked at her. "Worse for who?" She adjusted her purse strap and looked toward the hearse. "This is not the place." That was Beth all over. She was not loud. She was not clever. She was just very practiced at stepping away from the truth right before it touched her. At the luncheon, my mother's casserole dish was already on the serving table. It had masking tape on the handle in her neat block letters. Chicken tetrazzini. That was when I understood this had not been chaos. It had been managed. My parents had skipped the funeral. My mother had still made sure her handwriting arrived. People kept coming up to me with kind faces and paper plates. They said how sorry they were. Then their eyes kept moving to the door. The smaller flower spray my mother had chosen sat near the framed photo of Ben. Later I learned Dad had cut $620 from the order without telling me, and told the florist to keep it practical. I ate nothing. My napkin stayed folded in my lap. My mother's casserole dish stayed full until Naomi wrapped the leftovers in foil and told me not to look at it again. That should have been enough damage for one day. It wasn't. At 6:43 that night, after the cemetery, after the ham, after people had carried pie tins and sympathy plants back to their cars, the funeral home called. The $4,200 my father had promised had not been delayed. It had been reversed. No explanation. Just gone. I sat at Ben's desk with the lamp on and the rest of the house dark. His reading glasses were still beside a legal pad with his last grocery list. Coffee, zip bags, worm hooks, cough drops. Ordinary things look insulting when somebody is dead. I paid the balance myself from the savings account Ben and I had kept for a fall trip to Maine. Every number on the screen felt like a judgment. At 7:18, my mother finally texted, "We'll talk when you're calmer." I stared at that sentence until the screen dimmed. That was one of her favorite methods. Stay quiet until the facts settled, then arrive with language that made me look unreasonable for having lived through them. Ben's blue envelope was still in the top desk drawer under old church bulletins and a boat insurance renewal. I had seen it there all week and left it alone because he had told me to. Ben was not a dramatic man. If he sealed something, he had a reason. I put it on the desk and just looked at it. Thick blue paper. My name in his handwriting. Claire. I still did not open it. For a while, the house was very still. The refrigerator clicked on. A car passed outside. I could hear my own heel tapping the chair rung. Grief turns you into a woman who notices every stupid little sound because the big sound is gone. Then my phone lit up again. Beth. I almost let it ring out. I answered because I was tired of imagining what shape the next injury would take. Dad is upset, she said. He said you've been telling people they skipped on purpose. They did. They were dealing with something important. What was more important than Ben's funeral? The line went quiet. I could hear one of Beth's dogs barking in the background and the television running too loud. Then she said, Dr. Reese thought it was better if they stayed out of anything emotional today. I sat up. Who is Dr. Reese? A pause. Not confusion? A mistake. My friend uses him, she said too quickly. It's not a big deal. That was the first time I heard the name. I opened the blue envelope after I hung up. Inside was one folded note from Ben and a business card for Margaret Harper, Probate and Estate Administration. Ben's note was short. If your parents start calling you unstable, do not sign anything. Call Margaret first. Rose showed me copies after Christmas. They exist. Rose was my grandmother. I read the note 3 times. Ben had underlined, do not sign anything once. He did not need more. I thought the empty pew was the story. I thought the missing money was the story. I thought Beth's strange little line about a psychiatrist was just Beth making herself useful to the wrong people. I was wrong. Somewhere under my father's practical voice and my mother's careful silence, something had already started moving. The next evening, my parents invited the family to Sunday supper, as if nothing had happened. I was told there would be a plate for me if I wanted one. There was a plate for me. There had not been a seat for Ben. Would you have gone back to that table after that day? I went. Grief can make humiliation look temporary if you are tired enough. You start telling yourself one explanation will fix the room. You start telling yourself your mother will finally say your father went too far. You start telling yourself decency might still appear if you sit still long enough. My parents' dining room looked exactly the way it had for 20 years. Cream walls, lake photograph over the sideboard, silver candlesticks polished even in daylight, the roast already on the table. 6 places set, mine at the far end, facing the kitchen. Beth beside Mom, Dad at the head, Greg across from me. My chair was slightly lower than the others because one back leg had been repaired badly the winter before. That detail stayed with me. My mother was folding cloth napkins when I walked in. Avoidance, silence. Her eyes stayed on the corners. You made it, she said. Nobody said they were sorry about the funeral. Dad carved the roast before we sat down. Let's not turn this into a scene. That was his opening line. Not hello, not how are you holding up, just terms. I put Ben's funeral invoice beside my water glass. Then don't lie to me. Greg looked down immediately. Beth reached for the bread basket like her hands needed work. Mom placed my napkin by my fork without touching me. We did what had to be done, Dad said. What exactly was that? Protecting this family. There it was, the real object in my parents' house. Not people, not truth. Family as image. Family as thing. Something to preserve by arrangement. I asked where the $4,200 had gone. Dad said he reversed it because I was not making sound decisions, and he was not going to finance excess. He meant the flowers, the memorial cards, the luncheon that had fed half the church after he and Mom failed to appear. I said, Ben was my husband. Dad cut another slice of roast. And now you need to think clearly. Mom finally spoke. Strategic silence ending in a soft correction. Your father means long term. That made it worse. My father's cruelty was obvious. My mother's cruelty came wrapped in manners. Beth cleared her throat. Everybody is exhausted. I looked at her. You told me a psychiatrist told them not to come to the funeral. Greg's fork hit the plate. Beth's face shifted, but only a little. I said staying back might keep things calmer. You used his name. Dad put the carving knife down. Enough. The room went still. I could hear the ice maker dumping cubes in the freezer. That dinner should have broken the lie open. It didn't. After dessert, Mom handed me a white envelope. This might help. Inside was a business card for Dr. Alan Reese and a short note in her handwriting. He specializes in grief and family transitions. We already spoke with him. Please be reasonable. I remember the paper texture. Thick. Expensive. She had written the note before I arrived. That meant the entire dinner had been theater. The roast, the pie, the lower chair, the folded napkins. All of it was cover for that envelope. I was not being included. I was being managed. I stood up. Dad looked offended by the movement itself. We're trying to be practical, he said. I put the card back on the table. You met with a psychiatrist on the day of my husband's funeral. Mom said, not everything is about timing. It was one of the coldest things she ever said to me because it came out so calmly. The next 2 weeks turned quiet and organized. Dad left 3 voicemails telling me not to make major decisions about Ben's truck, the house, or his fishing boat. Mom texted reminders to eat, then slipped in phrases like oversight and support. Beth sent one message asking if I had considered temporary help with financial judgment. Financial judgment. That phrase stayed with me. Ben had done taxes for small businesses all over our county. I had run payroll and books beside him for 21 years. But once he died, my own parents started talking about me like I was one signature away from putting the house on Craigslist. I went back through our files. At first, I was looking for anything Ben might have meant by Rose showed me copies. Instead, I found 2 smaller things that sharpened everything. The first was a printout of a Christmas email from Rose thanking Ben for fixing the porch steps at the lake cottage and saying she was glad the place would finally go where care had gone. The second was a pharmacy receipt. Ben had paid $312.47 for Rose's medication refill the winter before, because Beth had forgotten again, and Dad said he was tired of bailing everyone out. That was my family in one sentence. Beth forgot, Dad complained. I covered it. Then later, they all acted like loyalty had simply appeared in the room for free. By mid-March, Aunt Sandra let slip that Dad had told several relatives I was not myself and should probably stay out of estate matters until summer. She said it gently, almost apologetically, as if gossip could remain harmless if spoken softly enough. That was when the humiliation changed categories. It was no longer only family. It was social now, portable, being carried into other rooms. Maybe my father believed money made him honest. I think it only made him louder. At 9:03 on a Tuesday night, my email chimed. The sender line said Ree's Behavioral Health. For 1 second, I thought they had the wrong address. They did. Beth had apparently forwarded something from her phone and typed the wrong Claire into autofill. The body of the email was one line. Claire, this is what Mom and Dad used. I didn't know he wrote it like this. Delete after reading. Attached was a PDF labeled Family Consultation Summary. I opened it. The consultation date was the morning of Ben's funeral. The presenting concern was me. I read the first page standing up in my kitchen with the phone screen lighting the counter because I could not make myself sit down. It said I was at risk for impaired financial judgment, emotional volatility, and possible attachment-based dependency around inherited property. It recommended family-guided delay of legal transfer decisions and temporary restriction from high-stakes documents during acute bereavement. There was a line that made my hands go cold. Support system reports long-standing over-identification with caretaking roles. My support system. My parents had sat with a psychiatrist and turned my life into a warning label. What do you even call it when grief becomes evidence against you? I printed the packet and spread the pages across Ben's desk. On page 3, under collateral history, there was one sentence that changed the shape of everything. Parents report upcoming trust and reserve distributions may be destabilizing. Trust and reserve distributions. That was not about my healing. That was about money. It was about Rose. It was about the lake cottage. It was about whatever Ben meant when he wrote, "They exist." I called Mom the next morning. She answered on the second ring like she had been waiting. "You had no right," I said. She did not ask what I meant. We were trying to prevent a crisis. By telling a psychiatrist I couldn't handle legal papers. We were trying to keep the family together. There it was again. Family image. Always presented as concern. Always paid for by the same person. Dad got on the line without warning. "Don't do this here." Here was a phone call. He still needed privacy for a lie. "I have the packet," I said. He went quiet one beat too long. Then he said, "If you keep pushing this, we may have to revisit everything Rose intended." That was the first direct threat. Not Ben. Not my grief. Rose intended. I hung up and called Margaret Harper. Her assistant gave me Friday at 10. Thursday night, Dad left one more voicemail. "If you want peace, sign what's put in front of you and stop embarrassing the family." I saved it next to the funeral home receipt and the PDF. By then, I knew enough to be afraid. By Friday, I knew enough to stop being afraid in the same way. If your own parents tried to turn your grief into paperwork, would you ever forgive it? Friday morning was gray and close, the kind of weather that makes every brick building look more official than it is. Margaret Harper's office sat over a bank downtown. Dark carpet, watercolor prints, a bowl of peppermints nobody touched. I sat there with Ben's blue envelope, the Reese packet, Dad's voicemail, Rose's Christmas email, and a folder I had labeled in block letters just to steady my hands. Funeral. Reese. Rose. Margaret Harper was in her 60s, neat, direct, and not interested in family language. I liked her immediately for that. She wore a navy jacket and read the Reese packet without making a face. That helped me more than sympathy would have. When she reached the line about inherited property, she looked up. "Did Dr. Reese ever evaluate you directly?" "No." "Did you sign a release?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone to discuss your legal capacity?" "No." She nodded once and kept reading. That was the first clean breath I had taken in weeks. I had expected comfort. What I got instead was structure. Margaret asked for dates, names, copies, recordings. She listened to the funeral timeline. She listened to the story of the reversed $4,200. She listened to Rose's last year, the porch steps, the pharmacy pickups, the winter weekends Ben and I spent at the cottage when Rose's arthritis got bad. She asked how often Beth had visited. I said maybe 3 times that year, usually long enough to take photos and leave with leftovers. Margaret opened a thin gray file and set it between us. "This," she said, "is why your husband told you to call." Inside was Rose's trust amendment from 2 years earlier. 4 clean pages, notarized. The lake cottage and the attached maintenance reserve, $126,000, were to pass to me outright upon distribution. Not to Dad for discretionary control. Not to the children equally. To me. There was also a handwritten letter of wishes. Margaret said it was not binding, but it mattered. Rose wrote that I had shown up without turning help into a favor later, and that she wanted me and Ben to have a place where care did not need permission. I read that line twice. Then Margaret showed me the delay request. 3 weeks after Ben died, Dad had submitted paperwork asking to pause distribution based on significant concerns regarding Claire Walker's emotional stability and susceptibility to impulsive decisions after bereavement. Attached was a short letter from Dr. Reese's office describing family-reported indicators and recommending caution around transfer. Family-reported indicators. The room changed around me. My parents had not skipped Ben's funeral because Beth needed them. They had skipped it because they were building a case against me. I heard Dad's voice again, exactly as he had said it. You were never worth the trouble. This time it did not land like insult. It landed like proof. A sentence that explained 40 years. Beth's needs were always urgent because urgency kept my parents feeling useful. My needs were always inconvenient because they assumed I would carry them anyway. That was the real midpoint. I had thought I was dealing with cruelty shaped by grief. I was not. I was dealing with a pre-written story, waiting for the right moment. How long can a woman stay calm before calm starts looking like surrender? Margaret did not waste words. She said the Reese letter was not enough on its own to undo the amendment, but it was enough to muddy the transfer, delay it, and pressure a grieving beneficiary into signing temporary control away. Enough to let family gossip do the work before legal facts caught up. Enough to turn hesitation into evidence. That mattered more than people admit. Most families do not need a judge to punish you. They only need a table full of people willing to treat you like the problem. I left Margaret's office with certified copies, a written plan, and a feeling I had not had since before Ben died. Not hope exactly. Something colder. Alignment. For 6 days, things looked quiet. That was the first false peace. No voicemails from Dad, no soft edits from Mom. Beth sent a photo of daffodils in her yard with the line, "Thinking of you." I did not answer. Then Lily called. Lily was Beth's daughter, 32, careful, observant, and usually smart enough to stay out of older people's damage. Her voice sounded thin. "Are you home?" "Yes." She came over with a manila folder and a face that told me she had not slept much. We sat at my kitchen table under the pendant light Ben had meant to replace for 2 years. Lily said, "Mom told me not to get involved." Then she slid her phone toward me. The first screenshot was from Beth's digital calendar. Morning of Ben's funeral. 8 a.m. Reese consult. W. Mom and Dad re-Claire. Trust delay. Bring notes. The second screenshot was a text from my mother to Beth the night before. Make sure Alan understands Claire gets attached to places and turns practical things into emotional ones. Practical things. Places. The lake cottage. Lily looked sick. I saw it a while ago. I thought maybe I was reading it wrong. Then after Sunday dinner, I heard Grandpa say they needed you to sign before Margaret complicated it. I knew that name because Great-Grandma Rose used to say it. I asked why she was showing me now. Because they used Uncle Ben's funeral to do it. There are moments when a family story stops being deniable. Not because the pain gets bigger, because the shape gets visible. Lily gave me copies and left before Beth could start calling. I sat there for a long time with the screenshots beside Rose's letter. My mother's text was clean, no cruelty on the surface. Just a woman reducing care into pathology because it was useful to do so. Maybe my mother thought silence made her innocent. I think it only kept her options open. By then I had enough to challenge the delay formally. Margaret filed notice the next morning and requested all communications used to support it. Dad responded through silence first, then through courtesy. That was new. He left a voicemail in his church voice. "Claire, let's handle this privately." Privately, meaning without witnesses. Mom texted after that. "I'm sure this can still be softened." Softened. Another one of her verbs. She never changed facts. She changed temperatures. I did not answer either of them. I spent that week doing things I should have done earlier. I moved the funeral bills into their own file. I changed my emergency contacts. I agreed to help the church office with bookkeeping until Easter. I sat in my car after errands and listened to silence instead of their messages. I was no longer waiting for permission to stand in the room. Then Margaret forwarded one more written confirmation from Dr. Reese's office. He had never examined me. His language had been based solely on information supplied by my parents and Beth. That was not the end of it. It was the first lie I could prove. At the end of the week, Margaret scheduled a family conference for final trust distribution. She wanted everyone there. Me, Dad, Mom, Beth, Greg. Carl Benson, the accountant handling reserve release. Lily, because she had documentation. Aunt Sandra, because Rose had spoken in front of her before. Naomi, because I asked her, and because some truths need one witness who loved your husband enough to hate what was done in his shadow. Dad called the night before. He did not yell. He sounded tired. You're making this uglier than it has to be. I looked at Ben's blue envelope on my desk and thought about the empty pew, my mother's casserole label, the lower dining chair, and that calendar entry sitting on Lily's phone like a dentist appointment. I said, "No, I'm just refusing to keep it pretty." Margaret's conference room sat on the third floor and faced the courthouse clock. Long, polished table, water glasses at every seat, firm notepads, a box of tissues placed far enough away to avoid offense and close enough to predict damage. I got there early. That mattered to me. For once, I was in the room before my parents. I set my folders down in a straight line. Blue envelope, funeral file, Reese packet, Rose amendment, Lily's screenshots, Dad's voicemails. Margaret had her own stack beside mine, tabbed and flagged. Carl Benson sat near the end with reserve ledgers and a laptop. Naomi came in last, squeezed my shoulder once, and took the chair behind me. Outside family witness, calm, loyal, not controllable. The room felt almost peaceful at first. Sun on the table, courthouse clock outside, papers arranged, water untouched. Then my parents walked in. Mom wore a pale green jacket I had seen at funerals, baptisms, and country club lunches when she wanted to look gentle without inviting intimacy. Dad carried no folder. He had always liked entering rooms as if authority should be enough paper. Beth and Greg followed. Beth saw the blue envelope and looked away too fast. Aunt Sandra came in with Denise. Lily entered separately and sat near Carl, not near her mother. Seats can become testimony before people do. Dad took the chair at the head until Margaret said, "Mr. Walker, I need you on this side for the trust documents." He moved, but slowly. The loss of position was small. The room felt it anyway. Margaret opened plainly. She reviewed Rose's amendment, the delayed distribution, and the purpose of the meeting. No speeches. No moral framing. Just order. Dad kept reaching for words like context and concern. Margaret let him finish once. After that, she raised a hand and he stopped. That was a new sound, my father being stopped by someone who did not belong to him. Carl reviewed the reserve account. $126,000. Maintenance set aside for the cottage. No discretionary access without transfer authority. He also noted that Dad had requested a hold after Ben's death and had cited mental instability concerns. Mom folded and unfolded a paper napkin even though there was no meal. Complicit silence. Let Dad speak. Let him absorb the first impact. Margaret placed Dr. Reese's letter on the table next. Dad tried first. We acted on professional guidance. Margaret slid a second sheet beside it. And this is written confirmation from Dr. Reese's office that he never evaluated Claire directly and that his comments were based solely on family descriptions. The room changed right there. Not loud, just visible. Beth looked down. Greg leaned back. Denise stared at the window. Aunt Sandra made the smallest sound in her throat. Dad said, "That doesn't mean our concerns were invalid." Nobody answered immediately. Silence can become a verdict faster than people expect. Margaret then asked Lily whether she was willing to authenticate the screenshots she had voluntarily provided. Lily's hands shook, but her voice held. She confirmed the funeral day calendar entry. She confirmed my mother's text. She confirmed hearing my parents and Beth discussing the need to get me to sign before Margaret complicated things. My mother finally spoke. "Lily, this is not the day for that." There it was. Strategic silence breaking only to protect appearance. Not denial, not comfort. Optics. Lily looked at her for 1 second, and then back at Margaret. It became the day for that when they used Uncle Ben's funeral. That line stayed in the room. My father's voice shifted after that. Less final, more irritated around the edges. We were trying to protect Claire from making choices under distress. I said, "You reversed my funeral transfer the same night." His jaw moved once. "Because you were overspending." Naomi leaned forward. First witness from the kitchen. First in-law voice. "He said that on speaker," she said. I heard him. He had already decided before the service started. Dad looked at her like he had forgotten in-laws could count. Margaret asked me to describe the funeral morning and the empty pew. I kept it short. That mattered. I did not decorate it. I described the call, the line, the missing transfer. The casserole dish with my mother's label arriving in place of my parents'. Carl Benson looked uncomfortable for the first time. Good. Neutral witnesses matter because they remind a family the truth is visible to strangers too. Then Margaret opened the section with Rose's letter of wishes. I watched my parents read. Dad hardened first. Mom did something worse. She looked tired, not guilty, tired, as if the real burden here was how inconvenient the truth had become. Rose had written that she wanted the cottage to go to me and Ben because we had cared for her without turning help into leverage. She wrote that Dad should not delay distribution based on temperament complaints, because he had always confused obedience with stability. Aunt Sandra let out a breath. She told me that once. That was an extra witness I had not needed but was glad to have. Dad pushed his chair back an inch. This is turning into an attack, Margaret said. No, this is the record. The courthouse clock struck noon outside the window while nobody moved, a real sound from outside the family system. Useful for that reason alone. By then, my parents knew they were losing control of the room. Dad kept reaching for private language. Mom kept trying to soften the edges of what had already landed. Beth stayed quiet enough to make her silence look chosen, not innocent. I looked at the blue envelope near my hand and realized I still had one piece left. The piece Ben had told me to save. I had thought I might never need it. Then Dad said, Claire has always been emotional about property. The cottage became an obsession. That was the reignition. The sentence that pulled every tired person in the room back into the center of the story. I put my hand on the envelope. When a room finally goes quiet for the right reason, do you speak first or let the paper speak for you? By then, would you have exposed them in front of everyone or let them keep one last version of themselves? The room was still when I opened Ben's blue envelope. Paper sounds different when people are already scared. Louder, cleaner. I took out the last folded note and the photocopies Ben had tucked behind it. Dad saw the copies first and stopped moving altogether. Mom looked from my hands to Margaret, then down at the table. Beth pressed her thumb into the rim of her water glass until her nail went white. I laid Ben's note in front of me, not for them. For me. Then I handed the copies to Margaret. Beat one was only that. The room, the table, the untouched water, the courthouse clock outside, Naomi behind me, Lily near Carl, Dad no longer at the head of anything. Beat two was the first paper. Margaret passed copies down the table. They were emails Ben had printed after Christmas, months before he died, because Rose had once asked him to check whether her amendment had been properly logged. The first was from Dad to Rose's former bookkeeper. Claire gets attached. We may need flexibility later if Beth's family needs the house more. The second was from my mother replying 2 days later. Alan says framing matters. If Claire is in a grief cycle by then, we can slow it down without looking cruel. Alan. Dr. Reese had not entered the story after Ben died. He had been part of the plan before Rose's final papers were even logged. I heard somebody inhale sharply. Denise, maybe. It did not matter. The sound belonged to the room now. Dad looked at me and said, low and furious, you were never worth the trouble. The third time, this time it did not reduce me. It reduced him. Naomi said, very clearly. There it is. Nobody corrected her. Beat 3 was the number and the name together. Carl confirmed the $126,000 reserve. Margaret confirmed the amendment. Lily confirmed the calendar entry and my mother's text. Margaret then read Dr. Reese's office confirmation into the record, including the line that no direct clinical opinion had been formed through personal evaluation. Not personal, not clinical, family reported. The language fell apart exactly the way I had hoped it would. Not with drama, with precision. Dad tried denial first. Those emails are out of context. Margaret said, then provide the context in writing. He had none. Mom tried softer ground. We were afraid Claire would cling to the cottage because of Ben. I said, I cared for Rose before Ben died. Mom looked down. That was the first time she had no phrase ready. Beat 4 was the reversal that changed the meaning of the whole story. Margaret took one final page from Rose's file. A short, handwritten addendum, initialed and stored with the amendment. I had never seen it before either. Rose wrote that, if any trustee attempted to delay or redirect the cottage based on family discomfort with Claire's independence, Margaret Harper was to step in immediately and remove discretionary handling from my father. Rose had anticipated him. Ben had anticipated him. The people who actually watched my family had seen them clearly. That seemed to hit Beth harder than the money did. Not because she was noble, because she suddenly understood she had been benefiting from a pattern other people found obvious. Beth whispered, "Mom." Just that. Hurt, but late. Greg spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. "Did you know about those emails?" Beth did not answer. There was the next argument sitting right there in the room. How much the favored child knows. How much she avoids knowing because the benefits arrive anyway. Dad reached for privacy again. "We can discuss this as a family," Margaret said. "We are. Outside family witnesses matter for exactly that reason. Once strangers are present, the family can no longer hide inside tone." Carl updated the release forms. Margaret removed Dad from any discretionary role over the reserve. The cottage and maintenance account moved according to Rose's amendment. Clean, recorded, undeniable. Dad signed because refusing would have looked worse, and by then image was all he still had. He signed hard enough to tear the top sheet slightly. Mom sat with both hands flat on the table. No folded napkin, no soft note, no casserole label, just skin on polished wood. I looked at her and realized something I should have understood years earlier. She had not stayed quiet because she was powerless. She had stayed quiet because silence preserved options. Avoidance when it helped. Complicity when it paid. Strategy when the room changed. That kind of silence leaves cleaner fingerprints. It is still guilt. When the papers were done, Margaret asked whether I wanted anything added to the record about Ben's funeral and the use of bereavement language to influence distribution. Dad said, "This is unnecessary." I said, "No, it isn't." I kept the statement short. "That mattered too," I said. "My parents skipped my husband's funeral to attend and support a psychiatric consultation meant to delay my inheritance and question my judgment. I said my father reversed promised funeral funds that same day. I said the record now showed the plan predated Ben's death and used grief as leverage." Margaret wrote every word down. Nobody objected after that. That silence was different from the silence in the church pew. Back then, nobody defended me. Here, nobody could defend them. I did not yell. I did not cry in the room. I put Ben's note back into the blue envelope, took my copies, and stood. Naomi stood with me. Lily looked like she might cry, but stayed seated. Beth still had her hand around the water glass. Greg was staring at Dad's torn signature page. Aunt Sandra would later tell 3 cousins exactly what happened, which was fine by me. "Some truths improve in circulation," Dad said. "You're really going to walk out over this?" I looked at him. "No, I'm walking out because of it." That was the boundary. I did not go to my parents' house after that. I did not answer Mom's calls the next week. I changed the locks at the cottage 2 days later and put one of Ben's old coffee mugs by the sink. The place smelled like cedar boards, cold dust, and the lake coming back after winter. I stood in that kitchen with the key Rose wanted me to have, and for the first time since Ben died, I felt something close to steadiness that did not come from being managed. There was one chair by the window with a loose spindle. Ben had always meant to fix it. I left it that way for a while, not as a shrine, just as proof that love had once existed in a room without becoming leverage. 3 weeks later, Mom sent one message. "I hope one day this can be softened." I never answered. Dad sent nothing. Beth wrote a month later and said she had not known how far they had gone. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was only true in the way favored children tell the truth, measured by what they were willing not to look at. I still think about the empty second pew at Ben's funeral sometimes. Not because my parents missed the service, because they used that absence like a tool and expected me to keep calling it concern. They lost the cottage. They lost the reserve. They lost the version of the family they thought could survive contact with the truth. And I still think my mother regretted being seen for what she was long before she regretted what she did to me.